Okay, in this lesson I believe we are going to finalize the branch generator, which you see here, by looking at the UV and displacement. And these ones that we do not cover probably come after, for example, a material. When we are going to create a tree ourselves in the next chapters, we are going to cover the materials or even hand drawing and a bit of segments as well. But things like animation are a bit advanced and not good for introduction course. And we have pretty much covered a lot of things by far. And these settings that you see in here are common alongside a lot of the generators that a speed tree has, for example, trunk and branch, and these trunk and branches and these presets all use these generators, all use these settings. And a lot of the generators later on that we are going to look at pretty much have these settings. And these settings are pretty common everywhere we go in a speed tree. So that's why I chose to explain the branch generator first and dedicated a good amount of time so that we understand the bare bones of tree creation inside a speed tree. So let's go for UV and displacement. UV and this UV section is responsible for projecting this texture that you see, this texture, onto the geometry that we create using these generators. So let me select this or the trunk, which is a lot better and we can see a lot more texture in it. So the texture that you see here is going to be wrapped around the geometry that we create in U and V, or in X and Y. If you're familiar with this concept, it's basically a 2D plane with two directions, one up and down and one from left to right. That this texture is going to be projected onto this so that we have this beautiful look created by a procedural material. And I believe this is a scanned, not procedural. So anyway, this UV section enables us to manipulate the U and V together or separately, depending on the needs that we have. And it's going to allow us to project this texture how we see fit and basically what we need. So the first one is unrestricted. Using this method, we have no limit on how much we are going to tile this texture around the geometry. For example, the U absolute value, we can increase it to get more texture tiling, but if you increase it so much, you're going to get ugly results. For example, like this. This is not what happens in nature. And of course, you should choose the numbers wisely. So this absolute value is going to allow us tile the texture in U. And of course, for the V, we have the scale, which is going to also scale this in V. And if we want to have a square texture, we tile them both together. For example, at a same number, for example, putting both of them to 2, for example, if you have a square texture. But this texture is not a square, so we'll leave that be. So let's take this back to its default state. The first mode is unrestricted. You can tile as much as you want without any problems. And the next one, U locked and V unrestricted, and it's going to always tile this only once, and no matter how much we increase this absolute number, we are not going to see any changes. But the V, we can change it and have as many tiling in this direction that we want. So the U is horizontal and V is vertical, and you should also have that in mind as well. So this is U and this is V. And the next mode is U and V locked into 0 to 1 UV space. And when you do that, it's only going to use this texture once in all of the geometry. And you see the texture resolution has become lower, and that is because we have tiled this texture only once across all of the geometry in U and V. And no matter how much we increase this, we are not going beyond 1. It's only going to tile once from 0 to 1 in both U and V. So if you have a texture that is big enough and you do not want it to tile, you can choose that option. But now we're going to use the unrestricted mode, and now you see how many texture is tiling. You see this texture has been tiled a lot of times, and we don't want that. So let's get it back to 1, and you can go to 2, and basically whatever value that you want. And it's a balance game between the resolution and tiling. And you see, by tiling, we are now seeing this repetition pattern in here, which is so obvious. So you want to avoid that as well. So the next one is plus relative. And this relative is going to tile the texture across the mesh that we have based on the geometry that it has. For example, let me set it to 0. And now using this relative, we can tile it based on the amount of the geometry that we have. And this absolute value, if we write, for example, 3, we are getting 3 tiles across the mesh. But this relative 3 is not like absolute. It's depending on the size of the mesh. And using this offset also allows us to offset the UV so that we are projecting different parts of the texture on different parts that we have here. For example, let me offset that. We are offsetting the UVs and showing different parts of the texture on different parts of the trees depending on our needs. And the next one is quite useful. It's fractional, and if you enable it, instead of getting this hard transition, let me bring this down and offset also down. And now look at here on what happens when I press this and bring it up. First, let me disable this one, and you see it only tiles without any fall off in between. It's like a straight jump from 1 to 2. But what happens if you want to have 1.5 tiling instead of 2 tiling? So that's where you enable this fractional, and now you have 1 tiling in here, and instead of going for 2, for example, you can have 1.5 tiling. And this auto also uses the best settings depending on the size of the mesh for you. And of course, you can use any value that you want. And it's not going to be only the transition in between the 1 and 2 and removing any fractional number. It's going to keep that fractional number, for example, 2.15. Using this method, you're only going to browse the real values, but this one also adds the fractional. And this twist also twists the texture around the geometry. So if you have a twisting mesh and want to twist it more even, you can use that here. And then we have the V. So far we have been manipulating the texture in U, in horizontal, and V is for vertical, from top to down. And the style, it also has absolute, relative, and the relative keep aspect ratio. First, let's go for absolute. Now we can use this scale. For example, let's make it 4. And now using this 4, we are seeing a good result. Let me disable the skew, and we are seeing a good result. And that is why, because this texture, if you look at it, is 512 by 248. And it's 4 times greater in this side to other side. So the aspect ratio is something like 1 to 4. So if I disable this fractional, you see this is what happens when we put it to 1 to 4 by keeping the aspect ratio. So this is what you can do, or you can bring it again to fractional and use any tiling that you want. And the next mode is relative keep aspect ratio. And if you use this, it's going to look at this value that you put in U, this 1, and assign this a scale in such a way that it keeps the aspect ratio that we had previously. So you see the aspect ratio is something like 1 to 4, and it's keeping the aspect ratio anywhere. So the next one is relative, and it's going to do something like this, but keeping the size of the geometry that we have here in mind when assigning that value. So let's put it to 2. Okay, we have something like this to move on. Okay, the next mode is a skew correction, and it's good for using in this mode, in this keep aspect ratio. If you set it to none, it's not going to skew the texture to fit into the aspect ratio. But if you set it to 1, it's going to skew the texture a bit to keep the aspect ratio in the texture. And pinching is good for stretching the texture in V. 0 is disabled. Let me make it 100, then 200, 300, excuse me, 300. It's going to skew the texture even more beyond this value that we have here. So let's make it 0. And this offset also does the same thing as this offset. It's going to project different parts of the texture on different parts of the mesh. Okay, this was for tiling, and I believe you have no problem if you have a bit of familiarity with 3D for using this tiling. The next mode is the displacement, and it's a great feature that SP3 has to give a bit of detail into the tree that we have. So the noise is going to either, by this source, look at a noise. It's going to procedurally create a noise and apply it over the tree, or it can use the material, and for this one to be affected you should have a height channel in here applied to your material, which this material doesn't have. And the next one is going to use a displacement, and for using this displacement you should go in here into this displacement tab and assign a black and white texture in here, which this one by far and by default has, and it's the same texture converted to black and white so that it has some parts in black which they are going in, and some parts in white which they are coming out, and some parts in between. And to assign a displacement you should do something that is close to your texture, and in this case it's the same texture but converted to black and white. You can go to here and click on here and choose from your files that you have, and then you're good to go to use this displacement. But first let's look at the noise. The first one is the radial amount, and it's basically a multiplier for the texture that we have, and it's going to add a lot of contrast into this if you're using a displacement, or if you're using a procedurally generated noise, it's going to make that also contrasty. So let's make this one 1, and you see that it's adding a lot of noise into the geometry that we have. But to add more geometry, it's good to go into these segments and add a bit of more geometry so that the transition becomes more automatic. So let's, for absolute, let's go 10 times more. And also good to know that we have a length and radial in here as well. Let's go in here and try to add in length, and let's add radial as well. And now it's fairly tessellated and we are good to go. But if you want a better result, you should do something to get these as a square. Now these are more like rectangles. Let me put it to something like 256, and now you see these are square like, and it's better to have them this way. But there's also a good practice to start your resolution and these segments right away when you start a project, because adding the resolution later on can change a lot of the things in the creation of the tree. It's going to move a lot of the branches away, so you should have that in mind as well. So for example, bringing accuracy up, look at what happens in the geometry. It selects and moves and removes a lot of the things. So before starting the project, just have in mind that if you want to increase the segments, do them right from the start of the project if you really do not want to lose any progress. So now let's go to displacement, and this radial amount, you see now it's a lot more beautiful than what we had previously. So let's go for something lower so that it's not so contrasty, and this length amount is going to displacement in other direction as well. For example, let's set it to 1, to 2. It's going to displacement in the direction of the spine, and shifts them around so that you have no overlapping UV in the V. overlapping vertices in the V. And after that, we have the U and V scale, and these are just like the UVs for the texture, but here it's for noise. So let me increase the U and V, and you see it's going to tile the noise across the geometry that we have. And sometimes it makes it better, and sometimes does something wrong. And then for the seed, if you are using the noise, it's going to shift the noise over to randomize the noise a bit better. So the next option is using the material. Of course, the material, we do not have any height, but it's similar to using the displacement. It's only affected in here instead of displacement. So let's put it to displacement. And now we are using that texture, that displacement texture on our geometry to give details to it. But it's obvious that we need to bring the tiling down. But instead of tiling, let's bring the radial amount down. For example, something like 15, so that it's less contrasty. And the tiling didn't change, and that is why it's using the UVs. It's looking at this UV section that we created and spread the displacement just like these textures, so that the UVs of both texture and displacement are matching. But instead, if you want to tile it independently of the texture, you can use fit to geometry instead of using UVs. And now you have separate tiling. For example, let me make it something so obvious, and something in here too. Now you see the amount of the tiling that it added. So it's good to, if you are using the same noise than you have here, it's good to set it to keep UVs so that it follows the UVs that you create here. And also it's good to keep in mind that this sharpness also can manipulate the contrast of the displacement that you add here. For example, this is linear growth. Let's set it to linear decay. Now you see the effect has been reversed. The vertices that were going in now are coming out, and the vertices that were coming in now are going out. And it's a reverse. So let's set it to linear growth again, because this is the default state. And yet again, if you feel like the geometry has been pushed around too much, you can always come back into here and make it less strong and weaker. The next option is the flare, and this flare is going to be good, for example, for adding these roots in here. Of course, we have the root generator, but this flare, this is the flare, and it's going to manipulate this bottom part of the tree. Let me make it something obvious, and it's good for manipulating that part. And we have the controls to set it to where we want. For example, you can tile the noise much or bring it down, or assign the height to each part you want to affect the geometry, and then you have the pinch to shift them around or bring them out more. And then there's the angle to shift it around to whichever angle you want. For example, let's set it to 45. Now it's the big part is in here. Let's set it to something like 30 and bring it down. And you're manipulating these flares. And of course, the seed is here to randomize it for you. Okay, this one is fine, and it's always going to add another layer of noise on top of this one. Of course, this one always is going to be procedural, and we cannot assign a texture to it. So if you increase the amount, you're adding more amount of noise onto the tree. For example, let me set it to 0.1. Now it's adding a slight noise, and now getting more and more. And using this sharpness, you can also make it reverse or disable it completely. And of course, using this scale, you're going to tile the texture the noise texture that a speed tree has, and it's always a default noise, you cannot change it. And the next one is shape, and this shape is also like this fine, but it's going to manipulate the radius of the tree, the radius of the bark, whenever you want, for example. And it's going to break the radius for you. It's going to create some lines, some vertical lines, and bring some in and bring some out. So let's see that in action. Let's set it to 1. And now you see some are coming in and some are going out. And it's going to happen vertically and in the radius. And twist is there to twist it for you, just like this. And the scale is also going to tile that. And the seed is also to randomize it to see whatever you want. And we did a lot of changes in displacement in here, but only the trunk, the main trunk, has been affected. So is there another way to apply this displacement onto this branch without going one by one, copying the numbers in? Yeah, you come in here and open this drop down menu, hit copy displacement, and it's going to copy all of the values you put into here, and then go for the layer of branch, for example, and then we have this one here, paste. Now you have done all of the parts in here as well, and it has successfully copied the whole part displacement into here, and now there's more consistency across all of them. And now again you can come into here, paste displacement into these as well, and do how many changes that you want.